The desert sun blazed mercilessly overhead as the wooden cart rattled along the dusty trail, leaving clouds of sand in its wake. Inside the cramped space, a young woman named Sarah thrashed violently against the ropes that bound her wrists and ankles. Her throat was raw from screaming, her dark hair matted with sweat and dirt. She had been traveling like this for 3 days now, stolen from her small farmhouse on the outskirts of Silver Creek by a gang of ruthless bandits who planned to sell her to the highest bidder in the lawless towns beyond the border. Sarah's mind raced, with memories of that terrible night when 5 masked men broke down her door. Her father had fought bravely, but he was no match for their numbers. They had knocked him unconscious and dragged Sarah away while her mother's screams echoed in the darkness. The last image she had of her home was her mother's tear-stained face illuminated by lamplight, growing smaller and smaller as the cart pulled away. The bandits were crude men who laughed at her tears and ignored her pleas. Their leader, a scarred man named Jack Sutton, had made it clear what fate awaited her. She would be sold to a brothel owner in Dusty Ridge, a town where the law had no reach and human lives were traded like cattle. Sarah refused to accept this destiny. Every moment she remained conscious, she fought. She kicked at the wooden walls of the cart, screamed until her voice gave out, and tried desperately to loosen the knots that held her captive. On the 3rd morning, something changed. The cart had stopped more frequently, and she could hear heated arguments among the bandits. Through the gaps in the wooden slats, Sarah caught glimpses of what was happening. A lone rider had been following them, staying just far enough away to avoid gunfire but close enough to make his presence known. The bandits were getting nervous, their voices sharp with tension and fear. As midday approached, Sarah heard the thunder of hoofbeats growing closer. Gunshots rang out, sharp cracks that made her heart pound even faster. The cart lurched violently as the horse pulling it reared up in panic. More shots followed, accompanied by shouts and curses. Sarah pressed herself against the floor of the cart, covering her head with her bound hands as best she could. The sounds of a fierce gunfight surrounded her, seeming to last for hours, though it could only have been minutes. Then, suddenly, silence fell across the desert. Sarah held her breath, her entire body trembling with fear and exhaustion. She heard the crunch of boots on sand, slow and deliberate steps approaching the cart, her mind filled with terrible possibilities. Had the bandits won? Was this Jack Sutton coming to punish her for the trouble she had caused? Or worse, was it some other outlaw, even more dangerous than the ones who had taken her? The cart's latch rattled and Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for whatever came next. The door swung open with a creak, flooding the dark interior with blinding sunlight. A figure stood silhouetted against the brightness, tall and broad-shouldered. Sarah's eyes slowly adjusted, and she saw a man unlike any of the bandits. He wore dusty leather chaps and a worn brown vest over a faded blue shirt. A weathered cowboy hat shaded his face, but she could see kind eyes beneath the brim, studying her with concern rather than cruelty. The man said nothing at first. He simply reached into the cart and began working on the ropes that bound her. His hands were rough but gentle, skilled fingers untying the complex knots with surprising speed. Sarah wanted to speak, to ask who he was and what he wanted, but her voice had been reduced to a hoarse whisper after days of screaming. She could only watch as he freed first her ankles, then her wrists, working patiently even when the rope refused to cooperate. As the last rope fell away, Sarah's arms dropped heavily to her sides. They were numb from being bound for so long, tingling painfully as blood rushed back into them. The cowboy stepped back, giving her space, and extended his hand to help her out of the cart. Sarah hesitated for a moment, studying his face more carefully. He appeared to be in his mid-30s with sun-weathered skin and a short beard that was dusty from the trail. There was something honest in his expression, something that made her instinctively trust him despite everything she had been through. She took his hand, and he helped her climb down from the cart. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet touched the ground. She had barely moved in 3 days, and her muscles screamed in protest. The cowboy steadied her, his strong arm supporting her weight until she could stand on her own. Sarah looked around at the scene before her. 5 bodies lay scattered across the desert sand, the bandits who had taken her now lying still beneath the unforgiving sun. Their weapons lay where they had fallen, and their horses had scattered to the 4 winds. The cowboy walked over to where the cart horse stood, still hitched and trembling from the violence it had witnessed. With careful movements, he began to unfasten the leather straps that connected the animal to its burden. Sarah watched as he worked, her mind struggling to process everything that had happened. Was she really free? Was this nightmare finally over? The horse shifted nervously as the cowboy removed the last of the harness, speaking softly to calm the frightened animal. When the work was done, the cowboy turned back to face Sarah. He looked at the horse, then at her, and finally spoke the words that would change everything. His voice was deep and steady, carrying across the empty desert with quiet authority. In that moment, standing in the blazing heat with the taste of freedom finally within reach, Sarah felt tears begin to stream down her dirt-stained cheeks. Not tears of fear or despair, but something else entirely, something she had almost forgotten existed during her 3 days of captivity. The cowboy's words hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. Sarah looked at the freed horse, then back at the man who had risked his life to save hers. She had so many questions, but for now, all she could do was stand there in the desert sun, finally free from her bonds, and wonder what would happen next in this strange turn of fate that had brought this mysterious cowboy into her life at the exact moment she needed him most. Sarah wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of dirt across her cheeks. The cowboy removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair before replacing it. He walked over to his own horse, a beautiful chestnut mare that stood patiently nearby, and retrieved a canteen from his saddlebag. Without a word, he handed it to Sarah. She took it with trembling hands and drank deeply, the water soothing her parched throat like nothing she had ever tasted before. "Thank you," she managed to croak out, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was going to die out here or worse." The cowboy nodded, his expression remaining serious. "Name's Daniel Crawford," he said simply. "I've been tracking this gang for near about 2 weeks now. They robbed a stagecoach outside of Silver Creek and killed the driver. When I got to your family's farm and saw what they'd done, I knew I had to find you before they reached Dusty Ridge." Sarah's heart clenched at the mention of her family. "My parents," she said urgently, gripping his arm. "Are they alive?" "Please tell me they're all right." Daniel's face softened. "Your mother is fine. She's the one who told me which direction they went. Your father took a nasty blow to the head, but the doctor said he'll recover. They're worried sick about you, but they're alive." Relief flooded through Sarah's body so powerfully that her knees buckled. Daniel caught her before she fell, helping her sit down on a nearby rock. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed, all the fear and tension of the past days pouring out of her in great shuddering waves. Daniel stood nearby, giving her the space to release her emotions while keeping a respectful distance. He understood that some things needed to be felt fully before healing could begin. When Sarah's tears finally subsided, she looked up at the desert landscape around them. The bodies of her captors still lay where they had fallen, a grim reminder of how close she had come to a terrible fate. She turned to Daniel with questions burning in her eyes. "You killed all 5 of them by yourself?" Daniel shifted his weight uncomfortably. "I'm not proud of taking lives, even men like these. I gave them a chance to surrender, to let you go peacefully. They chose to fight instead." He paused, looking out at the horizon. "I've been a marshal for 8 years now. Sometimes the job requires hard choices, but I always give men a chance to do the right thing first." Sarah studied him more carefully now. This wasn't just some random cowboy who had stumbled upon her plight. Daniel Crawford was a lawman, someone who had dedicated his life to protecting innocent people from men like Jack Sutton and his gang. She felt a deep gratitude toward him, but also a growing curiosity about the man who had saved her life. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. "How do we get back home?" Daniel walked over to survey the supplies scattered around the bandit camp. The men had been traveling with provisions, and he began gathering what would be useful for their journey. "Silver Creek is about 3 days' ride from here. We'll need to move carefully. These men might have had friends, and word travels fast in these parts. I don't want to take any chances with your safety." Sarah stood up, testing her legs and finding them more stable than before. She looked at the freed cart horse, which was now grazing on sparse desert brush nearby. "What about the horse? Shouldn't we use it?" "That horse has been through enough," Daniel replied. "We'll let it go. It'll find its way to water and maybe find a new life away from all this violence. You'll ride with me on Rosie." He gestured to his chestnut mare. "She's strong enough to carry us both, and she knows these trails better than most people." As Daniel packed supplies into his saddlebags, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. Among the bandits' belongings was a small leather pouch that she recognized immediately. It was her mother's medicine bag, the one that contained herbs and remedies passed down through generations of women in her family. The bandits must have taken it when they raided the farm. She picked it up carefully, holding it close to her chest like a precious treasure. Daniel saw her clutching the pouch and understood its significance without needing an explanation. "We should get moving," he said gently. "We've got maybe 4 more hours of good daylight, and I want to put some distance between us and this place before we make camp for the night." Sarah nodded and walked toward Rosie. The mare nickered softly, as if sensing that Sarah needed kindness. Daniel helped Sarah mount the horse first, then swung up behind her with practiced ease. Sarah tensed for a moment, not used to being so close to someone she barely knew, but Daniel seemed to sense her discomfort and maintained a respectful distance as much as the situation allowed. They set off across the desert, leaving behind the scene of violence and death. As Rosie carried them steadily forward, Sarah found herself relaxing slightly. The rhythmic sound of the horse's hooves and the gentle swaying motion were almost soothing, after the harsh treatment she had endured in the cart. She could feel the warmth of the sun on her face, and for the first time in days it didn't feel oppressive. It felt like freedom. As they rode, Daniel began to talk, perhaps sensing that Sarah needed distraction from the traumatic memories still fresh in her mind. He told her about his work as a marshal, about the towns he had passed through and the people he had helped. His voice was calm and measured, never boastful despite the dangerous work he described. He spoke of justice not as vengeance but as a necessary protection for those who couldn't protect themselves. Sarah found herself drawn into his stories, asking questions and gradually opening up about her own life. She told him about her family's farm, about the vegetables they grew and the small herd of cattle they raised. She spoke of her dreams to maybe one day open a school in Silver Creek, where children from the surrounding farms could learn to read and write. As she talked, she realized how close she had come to losing all of these dreams, and her gratitude toward Daniel deepened. The sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Daniel guided Rosie toward a small cluster of rocks that would provide shelter for the night. As they approached their camping spot, Sarah felt a strange mixture of emotions. She was free, she was safe, and she was heading home. But she also knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, and that the experiences of the past days had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Daniel dismounted first and helped Sarah down from the horse. Her legs were sore from the ride, but it was a different kind of soreness than the pain she had felt in the cart. This was the honest ache of muscles being used properly, of a body beginning to heal. As Daniel began to set up camp, Sarah looked back in the direction they had come from, then forward toward home. She was no longer the same woman who had been dragged from her farmhouse 3 nights ago. That woman had been transformed by fire and fear into someone stronger, someone who understood just how precious freedom truly was. The evening air grew cooler as Daniel built a small fire between the rocks. Sarah sat on a flat stone watching him work with efficient, practiced movements. He had gathered dry brush and wood from the sparse vegetation around them, arranging it carefully before striking flint to steel. Within minutes, flames danced in the growing darkness, casting warm light across their makeshift camp. Daniel had brought dried meat and hardtack from his supplies, and though the food was simple, Sarah ate hungrily. It was the first proper meal she had been given since her capture. The bandits had thrown her scraps occasionally, more to keep her alive than out of any sense of mercy. Now, sitting by the fire with the nightmare behind her, even the tough jerky tasted like a feast. "You should rest," Daniel said after they had eaten. He had spread out a bedroll for her near the fire, positioning it where the rocks would provide the most shelter from the wind. "We've got a long ride tomorrow and you need to recover your strength." Sarah looked at the bedroll, then at Daniel. "What about you? Where will you sleep?" "I'll keep watch," he replied, settling himself on a rock with his rifle across his lap. "These lands aren't entirely safe, especially after what happened today. Someone needs to stay alert." "You can't stay awake all night," Sarah protested. "You'll be exhausted tomorrow." A small smile crossed Daniel's weathered face. "I've gone longer without sleep before. Besides, I've learned to rest even while staying alert. It's part of the job." He looked at her seriously. "You've been through something terrible, Sarah. You need proper rest more than I do. Please don't worry about me." Sarah wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was catching up with her. The adrenaline that had kept her going was fading, and her body was demanding sleep. She lay down on the bedroll, surprised by how comfortable it felt after days of lying on the hard floor of the cart. The blanket Daniel had given her still smelled of horse and leather. but it was warm and clean, and she wrapped it around herself gratefully. As she lay there staring at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah found herself thinking about Daniel Crawford. He was unlike any man she had known before. The men in Silver Creek were good people, mostly farmers and merchants who worked hard and cared for their families. But Daniel was different. He lived a life of danger, tracking criminals across vast stretches of wilderness, putting himself in harm's way to protect strangers he had never met. "Daniel?" she called softly, unsure if he could hear her. "Yes?" His response came immediately from where he sat keeping watch. "Why did you become a marshal? It seems like such a dangerous life." There was a long pause before he answered. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, carrying the weight of old memories. "My sister was taken when I was 17. Bandits raided our town, killed my parents, and took Emma. I searched for her for 2 years, but I never found her." He stopped, and Sarah could hear the pain in the silence that followed. "I couldn't save my own sister, but I realized I could save other people's sisters and daughters. So I became a lawman. It's not much, but it's what I can do to make things right." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes again. She understood now why Daniel had risked everything to save her. She wasn't just another victim to him. Every person he saved was a chance to honor the sister he had lost, to give another family the happy ending his own had been denied. "I'm sorry about Emma," she whispered, "and I'm grateful that you didn't give up. You saved my life, Daniel. You gave my family back their daughter." "Get some rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow we'll ride hard and get you closer to home." Sarah closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come immediately. Her mind kept replaying the events of the past days, from the terror of her capture to the violence of her rescue. She thought about how fragile life was, how quickly everything could change. She had always known the world could be dangerous, but she had never truly understood it until now. The frontier was beautiful but unforgiving, full of both good people and bad, and survival often depended on which kind you encountered. Eventually, exhaustion won out over her racing thoughts, and Sarah drifted into an uneasy sleep. Her dreams were troubled, filled with echoes of gunshots and the faces of her captors. More than once she woke with a start, her heart pounding, convinced she was back in the cart. Each time, Daniel's calm voice reached her from his position near the fire, assuring her that she was safe, that he was there watching over her. When morning finally came, Sarah woke to find Daniel preparing coffee over the fire. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold. Despite her troubled sleep, she felt more rested than she had in days. The terror of her captivity was beginning to feel like a bad dream, something that had happened to someone else. They ate a quick breakfast of the remaining dried meat and fresh coffee, then packed up their camp with efficient teamwork. Sarah helped as much as she could, grateful to be doing something useful rather than being a passive victim. Daniel showed her how to properly secure the bedroll and supplies to Rosie's saddle, teaching her the knots that would keep everything in place during the long ride ahead. As they prepared to mount up, Daniel paused and looked at Sarah seriously. "I need to warn you about something. We're going to pass through some rough territory today. There are canyons and narrow passes where ambushes are common. I don't think anyone's following us, but we need to stay alert. If I tell you to do something, you need to do it immediately without question. Your life might depend on it." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "I trust you, Daniel. You've already proven you know what you're doing." They mounted Rosie together, and once again Sarah found herself sitting in front of Daniel as they set off across the desert landscape. The morning was cool and pleasant, with a light breeze that carried the scent of sage and dust. As they rode, Sarah noticed how Daniel's eyes constantly scanned the terrain around them, looking for threats that she would never have noticed. He was always alert, always vigilant, and his presence made her feel safer than she had in a long time. The hours passed slowly as they made their way through the challenging terrain. They navigated rocky canyons where the walls rose high on either side, blocking out the sun and creating shadows that could hide danger. Daniel chose their path carefully, sometimes backtracking to avoid areas that looked too risky. Sarah could tell that every decision he made was calculated to keep them as safe as possible, while still making progress toward Silver Creek. Around midday, as they were passing through a particularly narrow section of canyon, Daniel suddenly tensed behind her. His hand moved to his rifle and he pulled Rosie to a stop. "Don't move," he whispered urgently in Sarah's ear. Don't make a sound, Sarah froze, her heart beginning to race. She could feel Daniel's alertness, his body coiled and ready to react to whatever threat he had sensed. They waited in tense silence for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. Then Sarah heard it too, the distant sound of horses and men's voices echoing off the canyon walls. Daniel's hand covered Sarah's mouth gently, signaling her to remain absolutely silent. The voices grew louder, rough male voices discussing something Sarah couldn't quite make out. Her body went rigid with fear, memories of her captors flooding back. Were these more bandits? Had the gang that took her been part of something larger? She could feel Daniel's steady breathing against her back, his calm presence the only thing keeping her from panicking completely. Slowly, carefully, Daniel guided Rosie backward into a narrow crevice between two large boulders. The space was barely wide enough for the horse, but it concealed them from the main path. Daniel dismounted silently and placed his hand on Rosie's muzzle. A gesture the horse seemed to understand meant she needed to stay quiet. Sarah remained frozen in the saddle, barely daring to breathe as the voices and hoofbeats came closer. Through a gap in the rocks, Sarah could see 3 riders pass by their hiding spot. They were rough-looking men, armed and weathered by the harsh frontier life. One of them was talking loudly about a poker game he had lost in some town Sarah had never heard of. They didn't appear to be searching for anyone specifically, but there was something dangerous about them, a casual violence in how they carried themselves that reminded her too much of the men who had taken her. The riders passed without noticing the hidden alcove where Daniel, Sarah, and Rosie waited in tense silence. The sound of their horses gradually faded as they continued through the canyon. Even after the voices had disappeared completely, Daniel waited several more minutes before moving. He was taking no chances, making sure the men were truly gone before exposing themselves again. Finally, Daniel relaxed slightly and helped Sarah down from the horse. Her legs were shaking and she had to lean against Rosie for support. "Are they gone?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, they're gone," Daniel confirmed, though his eyes still scanned the canyon walls cautiously. Those were probably just drifters, not necessarily looking for trouble, but not the kind of men you want to meet on a lonely trail either. "Out here, it's better to avoid strangers when possible." Sarah nodded, understanding the wisdom of his caution. The frontier operated by different rules than the civilized towns back east. Trust had to be earned, and strangers could be deadly threats as easily as they could be friends. Daniel had survived this long by being careful, by trusting his instincts and never taking unnecessary risks. They remained in their hiding spot for another hour, giving the riders plenty of time to get far ahead. Daniel used the time to check Rosie's hooves and adjust their supplies. Sarah sat on a rock, trying to calm her racing heart. The brief moment of fear had reminded her that they weren't safe yet, that the journey home was still fraught with danger. When Daniel finally deemed it safe to continue, they emerged from their hiding spot and resumed their journey through the canyon. The sun was past its peak now, beginning its slow descent toward evening. Daniel pushed them a bit harder, clearly wanting to make it through the most dangerous terrain before nightfall. Sarah held on tightly as Rosie picked her way over rocky ground and through narrow passages that seemed barely passable. As the afternoon wore on, they finally emerged from the canyons into more open country. The landscape here was less harsh, with scattered trees and patches of grass that seemed impossibly green after the barren desert. Daniel visibly relaxed as the terrain opened up, though Sarah noticed he never completely let down his guard. His eyes still roamed constantly, alert for any sign of danger. "We're making good time," Daniel announced, the first words he had spoken in hours. "If we keep this pace, we should reach Silver Creek by tomorrow evening, maybe earlier if we push hard." The thought of home, of seeing her parents again, filled Sarah with a mixture of joy and anxiety. She was desperate to return to let them know she was safe, but she also felt changed by her ordeal. Would her parents understand what she had been through? Would life ever feel normal again after experiencing such terror and witnessing such violence? As if sensing her troubled thoughts, Daniel spoke again. "What you've been through, Sarah, it's not something you just forget. There'll be nightmares probably for a while, moments when something reminds you of it all and the fear comes rushing back. That's normal. It doesn't mean you're weak or broken. It means you survived something terrible, and your mind is processing it." Sarah was surprised by his insight. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "I am," Daniel admitted. After I lost Emma, after I spent 2 years searching and finding nothing but dead ends and disappointment, I thought I'd never feel normal again. I had nightmares where I found her but couldn't save her, or where I was always just one step behind the men who took her. It took time, but eventually, the nightmares came less frequently. The pain didn't disappear, but I learned to carry it differently, to use it to drive me forward rather than hold me back. His words gave Sarah hope. If Daniel could survive his tragedy and build a meaningful life from the ashes of his loss, perhaps she could find a way to move forward too. She had her family waiting for her, and she had her dreams for the future. The bandits had stolen days of her life and peace of mind, but they hadn't stolen everything. She was still alive, still herself, and that had to count for something. They rode until the sun began to set, then made camp in a grove of cottonwood trees near a small stream. The presence of water lifted everyone's spirits, and even Rosie seemed pleased as she drank deeply from the clear running water. Daniel caught some fish from the stream with surprising skill, and soon they were cooking fresh food over the fire. A welcome change from dried meat and hardtack. As they ate, Sarah found herself talking more freely than she had before. She told Daniel about her childhood, about growing up on the farm with her parents who had emigrated from the East looking for a better life. She spoke of her younger brother who had died of fever when he was only 6, and how that loss had made her parents more protective of her, their only remaining child. She shared her dreams of opening a school, of teaching children not just reading and writing, but also about the wider world beyond their small farming community. Daniel listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and sharing stories of his own travels. He told her about the different territories he had passed through, the various towns and settlements, some thriving and some barely hanging on. He spoke of the good people he had met, lawmen and ordinary citizens who were trying to build something decent in the wilderness, fighting against the chaos and lawlessness that threatened to consume everything. As the fire burned low and the stars appeared overhead, Sarah felt something unexpected stirring in her heart. Despite the circumstances of their meeting, despite the violence and fear that had brought them together, she found herself drawn to Daniel Crawford. There was something solid and dependable about him, a quiet strength that made her feel safe. He wasn't flashy or loud like some of the young men back in Silver Creek who tried to court her. He was genuine, honest, and brave in a way that had nothing to do with bravado and everything to do with character. But Sarah quickly pushed these thoughts aside. Daniel was a marshal, a man who lived a dangerous life tracking criminals across the frontier. He had saved her, yes, but that didn't mean there was anything more between them than the circumstantial bond of rescuer and rescued. Once he delivered her safely home, he would move on to his next assignment, and she would return to her ordinary life. That was how it had to be. Still, as she lay down on the bedroll that night, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what might have been different if they had met under other circumstances. If Daniel had ridden into Silver Creek on some official business and they had been introduced at a town social or Sunday service, would there have been a chance for something more? It was a foolish thought, she told herself, a romantic notion born of gratitude and the strange intimacy of their shared journey. Tomorrow they would reach home, and this brief chapter of her life would close, leaving only memories and perhaps occasional nightmares to mark that it had ever happened. Morning came with a gentle rain, light drops that pattered against the leaves of the cottonwood trees and created a soothing rhythm. Sarah woke to find Daniel already up, checking their supplies and preparing Rosie for the final leg of their journey. The rain didn't seem to bother him. If anything, he seemed pleased by it, explaining that the wet ground would make their trail harder to follow if anyone was trying to track them. They shared a quick breakfast of the leftover fish from the night. Before and some coffee Daniel brewed over a hastily rebuilt fire. The rain picked up slightly as they prepared to leave, but Daniel assured Sarah it wouldn't slow them down much. He helped her mount Rosie, then swung up behind her and they set off through the rain-washed landscape. The countryside was beautiful in the rain. Everything seemed fresher, cleaner, and the scent of wet earth and grass filled the air. Sarah found herself relaxing despite the weather, leaning back slightly against Daniel as Rosie carried them steadily homeward. They talked little during this final stretch, both lost in their own thoughts about what awaited them at journey's end. By mid-morning, the rain had stopped and the sun broke through the clouds, creating brilliant rainbows across the sky. Sarah gasped at the beauty of it and she felt Daniel's quiet chuckle behind her. Take it as a good sign, he said. Nature's way of welcoming you home. As the hours passed, the landscape began to look increasingly familiar to Sarah. She recognized certain rock formations and stands of trees that marked the approaches to Silver Creek territory. Her heart began to beat faster with anticipation and nervousness. Soon she would see her parents again, would have to explain everything that had happened. She would have to face the questions and the concern, the inevitable whispers from neighbors about what she had endured. It was late afternoon when they crested a hill and Sarah saw it. The scattered buildings of Silver Creek spread out in the valley below. Smoke rose from chimneys and she could see people moving about their daily business, completely unaware that she was finally coming home. Tears sprang to her eyes, but these were tears of relief and joy rather than fear or pain. "We're almost there," Daniel said unnecessarily, his voice gentle with understanding. "Your parents are going to be so happy to see you." They rode down the hill and into the town. People stopped what they were doing to stare as they passed. Sarah could see recognition dawning on their faces, followed by shock and excitement. A young boy ran ahead, shouting that Sarah Mitchell was back, that she was alive and riding with the marshal. By the time they reached the main street, a small crowd had begun to gather. Sarah's mother appeared first, running from their house with her apron still on, flour dust on her hands. She was crying before she even reached them, her face a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming joy. Daniel brought Rosie to a stop and helped Sarah down just as her mother reached her, pulling her into an embrace so tight Sarah could barely breathe. My baby," her mother sobbed, holding Sarah's face in her hands and looking at her as if to convince herself this was real. "I thought I'd never see you again. Thank God you're safe." Sarah's father appeared moments later, moving more slowly with a bandage still wrapped around his head from the injury he had sustained trying to protect her. But his eyes were bright with tears as he joined the embrace. The three of them standing in the middle of the street, holding each other and crying without shame or reservation. Daniel had dismounted and stood a respectful distance away, holding Rosie's reins and watching the reunion with a soft expression on his weathered face. Sarah looked at him over her mother's shoulder and mouthed, "Thank you." The words inadequate for what he had done, but all she could manage in the moment. The town doctor approached, wanting to check Sarah over and make sure she was unharmed. Her parents reluctantly released her, though her mother kept one hand firmly gripping Sarah's arm as if afraid she might disappear again if she let go. As the doctor led them toward his office, Sarah looked back at Daniel, suddenly panicked that he might leave before she had a chance to properly thank him. But Daniel was being surrounded by townspeople himself, the sheriff shaking his hand vigorously and thanking him for bringing Sarah home safely. Others were offering him food, lodging, and expressing their gratitude for what he had done. Daniel accepted their thanks with quiet humility, deflecting praise and simply stating he was glad Sarah was home safe. The doctor's examination was thorough but gentle. He checked Sarah for injuries, noting the rope burns on her wrists and ankles, the bruises from being thrown around in the cart, and the dehydration and exhaustion that had taken their toll. But overall, he declared her remarkably healthy considering the ordeal. He gave her mother instructions for care, emphasizing rest, good food, and time to heal both physically and emotionally. When Sarah emerged from the doctor's office, twilight was settling over Silver Creek. Her parents wanted to take her home immediately, to tuck her into her own bed and keep her safe within familiar walls. But Sarah hesitated, looking around for Daniel. She spotted him near the livery stable, preparing to settle Rosie for the night. Without thinking, she pulled away from her parents and hurried toward him. "Daniel," she called, and he turned at the sound of his name. In the fading light, his face was harder to read, but she thought she saw something warm in his eyes when he looked at her. "I never got to properly thank you. You saved my life, you brought me home, you gave me back my future." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, clearly not accustomed to such direct gratitude. "I was just doing my job, Sarah. Any lawman would have done the same." "No," Sarah said firmly, stepping closer. "Not any lawman. You tracked those men for days. You risked your life facing 5 armed bandits alone, and you kept me safe on the journey home. You gave me hope when I had none left. That's not just doing a job. That's being a good man." For a moment they stood there in the growing darkness, the sounds of the town fading around them. Daniel looked down at her with an expression Sarah couldn't quite decipher. There was gratitude in his eyes, but also something else, something that might have been regret, or perhaps longing. Your parents are waiting, Daniel said finally, his voice gentle. Go home, Sarah, be with your family. That's what matters now. Sarah nodded, knowing he was right but feeling strangely reluctant to leave. Will you stay in town for a while? You must be exhausted too. You haven't slept properly in days. I'll stay tonight, Daniel agreed. The sheriff has offered me a room at the boarding house, but I'll need to move on tomorrow or the day after. There's always more work to be done, more people who need help. Of course, Sarah said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. She had known this was coming, had told herself not to expect anything different, but it still hurt somehow. Well, you'll come to dinner tomorrow night, won't you? My mother will want to feed you properly, and my father will want to thank you himself. Daniel smiled, the first real smile Sarah had seen from him since they met. I'd like that. Tell your mother I'll be there. Sarah returned to her parents, who welcomed her with open arms and led her home. The house looked exactly as she remembered it, every detail achingly familiar. Her mother had kept her room exactly as it was, as if maintaining everything in perfect order might somehow bring Sarah back. Now that she was here, her mother fussed over her endlessly, bringing her favorite foods, fresh clothes, and staying close by as if afraid to let her out of sight. That night, lying in her own bed for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah found sleep difficult despite her exhaustion. Her mind kept returning to Daniel, to the feel of riding with him, to the sound of his voice telling her she was safe, to the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. She told herself again that these feelings were just gratitude, just the natural attachment someone might feel toward their rescuer. But deep down she knew it was more than that. The next evening, Daniel arrived at their house precisely on time, cleaned up and wearing what were clearly his best clothes, though they were still worn from travel and hard use. Sarah's father greeted him warmly, thanking him repeatedly for bringing back his daughter. Her mother had prepared a feast, putting every cooking skill she possessed into creating a meal worthy of the man who had saved her child. Over dinner, Daniel told them the full story of the rescue, details he had spared Sarah during their journey. He explained how he had tracked the gang, how he had waited for the right moment to strike, and how he had taken them down one by one to ensure Sarah's safety. He spoke matter-of-factly, without embellishment or pride, treating it as simply a job that needed doing. But Sarah's parents looked at him with such gratitude and respect that Daniel seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. After dinner, Sarah walked Daniel out to the porch. The night was clear and cool, stars brilliant in the sky above. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the sounds of the evening settling over the town. I'm leaving in the morning, Daniel said finally. There's been word of trouble up north, a gang attacking mining camps. I need to get there before anyone else gets hurt. Sarah's heart sank, though she had known this moment was coming. You're always riding toward trouble, aren't you? Always putting yourself in danger to help strangers. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying Daniel's words over and over. Part of her was angry that he had dismissed her feelings so easily, as if he knew better than she did what was in her heart. But another part understood his reasoning. He was trying to protect her from the harsh reality of his life, from the uncertainty and danger that followed him everywhere. By dawn, Sarah had made a decision. She dressed quickly and quietly, not wanting to wake her parents who were sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. She slipped out of the house and made her way through the still sleeping town to the boarding house. Daniel's horse was already saddled in front, and she could see through the window that he was settling his bill with the proprietor. Sarah waited outside, her heart pounding with nervousness and determination. When Daniel emerged, he stopped short at the sight of her standing there in the early morning light. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with unspoken words. I'm not here to beg you to stay, Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady despite the emotions churning inside her. I understand that you have work to do, that you have a calling that drives you. I respect that about you, Daniel. I respect who you are. Daniel's expression was guarded, but she saw him listening carefully to her words. But I need you to hear this, Sarah continued, stepping closer. What I feel isn't just gratitude. What I feel isn't going to fade away when life returns to normal. I've spent my whole life in this town, Daniel. I've known safety and comfort and ordinary happiness. And then you came along and you showed me what real courage looks like. You showed me what it means to live for something bigger than yourself. And yes, that scares me a little. The thought of caring for someone who lives such a dangerous life, it terrifies me. But you know what scares me more? The thought of never taking that chance. The thought of playing it safe and always wondering what might have been. She paused, gathering her courage for what she needed to say next. I'm not asking you to change who you are or give up your work. I'm not asking you to stay in Silver Creek and become someone different. I'm just asking you to consider that maybe, just maybe, you don't have to do it all alone. That maybe someone could be waiting for you when you come back. Someone who understands the importance of what you do and is willing to wait because you're worth waiting for. Daniel's careful control finally cracked, and Sarah saw the conflict in his eyes. The battle between what he wanted and what he thought was right. Sarah, you don't know what you're asking. The waiting, the worry, never knowing if I'll come back from the next job. I've seen what that does to families, to people who love lawmen. It's not fair to ask someone to live that way. Life isn't fair, Sarah replied, her voice firm. I learned that when bandits broke into my home and dragged me away. I learned it when I thought I was going to die or worse in that cart. But I also learned that the good things in life, the things worth having, they're worth fighting for. They're worth taking risks for. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of fabric, torn from the hem of her dress. She had embroidered it with thread she found in her mother's sewing basket, working by candlelight through the sleepless night. It was simple, just her initials intertwined with his, but she had poured all her feelings into every stitch. Take this with you, she said, pressing it into his hand, not as a burden or an obligation, but as a reminder that you have someone thinking about you, someone hoping you'll come back safe. And if you decide that's not what you want, if you decide that your life is better lived alone, then that's your choice and I'll respect it. But don't make that choice out of fear, Daniel. Don't make it because you think you're protecting me from something I've already chosen to face. Daniel looked down at the embroidered cloth in his palm, his thumb tracing the careful stitching. When he looked back up at Sarah, his eyes were bright with emotion he no longer tried to hide. You're remarkable, you know that? You've been through hell and here you are, braver than most men I know. I learned it from you, Sarah said softly. You showed me what real bravery looks like. Now I'm showing you that it comes in different forms. Daniel carefully folded the cloth and tucked it into his vest pocket, over his heart. I have to go, he said, but his voice held a note of promise it hadn't before. There are people up north who need help and I can't let them down. I know, Sarah said, blinking back tears. Go help them. Do what you do best. But Daniel, she added, her voice catching slightly, please come back. When the job is done, when those people are safe, come back to Silver Creek. Come back to me. Daniel reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his calloused palms gentle against her skin. For a long moment he just looked at her, as if memorizing every detail of her face. Then slowly he leaned down and kissed her forehead with such tenderness that Sarah felt her heart might break from the sweetness of it. I'll come back, he promised, his voice rough with emotion. I can't promise when, and I can't promise there won't be times when you'll hate me for making you worry. But I'll come back, Sarah, I give you my word. Sarah threw her arms around him, holding him tightly for a moment that felt both too long and not nearly long enough. Then she forced herself to step back to let him go do what he needed to do. Daniel mounted Rosie, looking down at Sarah from the saddle. The rising sun caught his face, highlighting the determination and the hope that warred in his expression. Be safe, Sarah whispered. Always am, Daniel replied with a small smile, the first one she had seen that reached his eyes. Or at least I try to be. Now I have an even better reason to make it back in one piece. He turned Rosie and rode slowly down the main street of Silver Creek. Sarah watched him go, standing in the early morning light, her hand pressed against her heart. She watched until he crested the hill at the edge of town and disappeared from view. Only then did she allow herself to cry, tears that were equal parts sadness and joy, fear and hope. Sarah's mother found her standing there a short while later and wrapped her in a comforting embrace. He'll come back, her mother said with the quiet confidence of someone who understood love and sacrifice. A man doesn't look at a woman the way he looks at you and not come back. Over the following weeks, life in Silver Creek slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. Sarah resumed her work on the farm, helping her parents with the daily tasks that sustained their lives. She began making plans for her school, speaking with the town council about acquiring land and materials. She was determined to move forward with her dreams, to not let the trauma of her kidnapping define the rest of her life. But every day she thought of Daniel. She wondered where he was, what dangers he was facing, whether he was safe. She touched the matching piece of embroidered cloth she had kept for herself, drawing comfort from knowing he carried its twin over his heart. She wrote letters she would never send, pouring out her thoughts and feelings onto paper, keeping a record of her days that she might one day share with him. And she waited, not with passive resignation but with active hope. She lived her life fully, pursued her dreams vigorously, and built the future she wanted. But through it all, she kept a space in her heart for the marshal who had saved her life and, in doing so, had captured her heart completely. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah was helping her mother hang laundry when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. She turned, her heart suddenly racing, and saw a familiar figure riding into town on a chestnut mare. Daniel looked tired and dusty from the trail, but his eyes found her immediately, and the smile that broke across his weathered face was like the sun breaking through clouds. Sarah dropped the sheet she was holding and ran toward him, not caring what the neighbors might think or say. Daniel dismounted before Rosie had even come to a complete stop and caught Sarah in his arms, lifting her off her feet and holding her close. They stood there in the middle of the street, oblivious to the gathering crowd, just holding each other and laughing with the pure joy of reunion. "I came back," Daniel whispered against her hair. "I said I would, and I did." "I knew you would," Sarah replied, pulling back just enough to see his face. "I never doubted it for a moment." Daniel reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the embroidered cloth she had given him. It was worn and faded from being carried everywhere, clearly treasured and frequently touched. "This kept me safe," he said. "Every time things got dangerous, I'd touch it and remember what I had to come back to." Sarah smiled through her tears. "Does this mean what I think it means? If you're asking whether I'm still too stubborn and scared to admit I love you, then no," Daniel said, his eyes shining with emotion. "I love you, Sarah Mitchell. I love your courage, your strength, your kind heart, and your stubborn refusal to give up on a worn-out lawman who didn't know he was looking for a home until he found it in you." "I love you too," Sarah said, the words she had been holding inside for months finally free. "And yes, I know what I'm choosing. I know the life we'll have won't be easy, but it will be ours, and that's all that matters." Daniel kissed her then properly and thoroughly, while the people of Silver Creek cheered and applauded.